My name is Cora, and I'm 28 years old. For as long as I can remember, I've been the quiet footnote in my family's story. They called me their daughter, but I always felt like a stranger they were obligated to house, a placeholder in the family portrait. Last month, at what was supposed to be the happiest night of my life, my own engagement party, my father raised a glass and toasted to my future by calling me adopted trash in front of everyone I knew. The room went silent, but my world exploded. What he didn't know was that his one cruel joke would become my obsession, pushing me to uncover a secret buried for 30 years, a secret I found in a simple DNA test. And when I revealed the results, the silence that followed was a different kind entirely. It was the sound of a dynasty crumbling to dust. If you've ever felt like an outsider in your own home, drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from. This story is for you. And before I get into the shocking truth that changed everything, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life stories about family secrets and the surprising power of the truth. Trust me, you will not want to miss how this ends. Before that disastrous engagement party, my life was a long, quiet lesson in the art of being invisible. I'm a professional genealogist, a historian of family trees, which is deeply ironic considering I always felt like a grafted foreign branch on my own. I spend my days building narratives from the whispers of the past, from dusty census records, faded ship manifests, and forgotten photographs. It's a job that requires immense patience and precision, traits that were absolutely essential for surviving my own childhood. My parents, Marcus and Eleanor, were masters of a particular, corrosive kind of conditional love. They provided for me, yes, a roof over my head in their sprawling suburban home, food on the table, a top-tier education. But warmth, genuine pride, the profound feeling of being truly seen, that was a currency reserved exclusively for my older brother Julian. Julian was the sun in our family's solar system, and we were all expected to orbit him. He was charismatic, athletic, and coasted through life on a golden wave of our parents' unabashed adoration. His report cards, even with a sea of mediocre grades, were praised for their potential. His soccer trophies, many for mere participation, lined the grand mantelpiece. When he got a C on a calculus exam, my father hired him the most expensive tutor in the city, declaring it a failure of the school system. The following month, when I was inducted into the National Honor Society, my mother nodded distractedly and said, "That's nice." "Dear," before asking if I had remembered to pick up Julian's dry cleaning for his weekend trip. The pattern was set early and reinforced with the brutal consistency of a metronome. For my 16th birthday, I had saved up for months to buy a rare, leather-bound book on medieval manuscripts. My parents gave me a $100 gift card to a department store, telling me to buy something practical. That same year, for Julian's 18th, they presented him with the keys to a brand new convertible, the red bow on top bigger than my entire birthday cake. When I once gently pointed out the stark disparity, my father sighed, his voice thick with a familiar disappointment. "Cora, you need to understand. Julian has a certain social standing to maintain. Your hobbies are more private. They don't require the same level of investment." This disparity wasn't just about money. It was about the allocation of their energy, their attention, and their emotional real estate. I learned to celebrate my own achievements in silence, my triumphs confined to the quiet echo of my own mind. I put myself through college on a patchwork of academic scholarships and grueling part-time jobs, studying history and archival sciences because it was my passion. I was proud of my hard-won independence, but a small, persistent part of me always yearned for even a sliver of the effortless approval they showered on my brother. Julian, meanwhile, followed my father into the world of finance, securing a high-paying position at my father's firm that everyone knew he hadn't earned on merit. He lived in a swanky downtown apartment, his rent heavily subsidized by my parents, and spent his weekends at country clubs and yacht parties, cultivating the social standing my father was so keen on. I lived in a small, book-filled apartment on the other side of town, where my greatest luxury was a high-quality scanner for digitizing fragile, 100-year-old documents. In my parents' eyes, I was reliable, responsible, and ultimately uninteresting. I was the one who remembered their anniversary, who organized holiday gatherings, who drove my mother to her doctor's appointments, and who visited them every single Sunday without fail. Julian would breeze in once a month, charm them for an hour with recycled stories of his exploits, and leave them glowing with a pride that was almost blinding. They'd spend the next week recounting every clever thing he said, while my hours of quiet conversation, of genuine connection, were forgotten the moment I walked out their door. The family narrative was immutable. Julian was the legacy, their shining success, the heir to the family name. I was the caretaker, the background character, the responsible but unremarkable daughter. I had accepted this role, not happily, but with a weary resignation born from years of reinforcement. It was simply the way things were. I poured my passion into my work, finding more belonging in the intricate stories of long-dead families than I ever did in my own. I thought I could navigate this dysfunctional dynamic forever, keeping my head down and my heart carefully guarded. But then I met Ethan, and for the first time in my life, someone saw me as the main character. And in my parents' eyes, that was a transgression they simply couldn't forgive. I had no idea that this one happy moment was the trigger that would lead to the complete and utter demolition of the family I thought I knew. I met Ethan at a historical society gala, a fundraising event I attended more out of professional obligation than social desire. He was a successful architect, and to my absolute delight, he was just as fascinated by the city's hidden histories and forgotten landmarks as I was. When I started talking about my work, about tracing a family line back to the city's founding fathers through property deeds, his eyes didn't glaze over. Instead, he leaned in, asking insightful questions about my research methods. He admired my passion instead of finding it peculiar, or, as my parents would say, a charming little hobby. For the first time, I felt like I didn't have to shrink myself or apologize for my interest to be palatable. Ethan was handsome, intelligent, and deeply kind. But the most attractive thing about him was the way he looked at me like I was the most interesting person in the room, holding a secret he was desperate to learn. Our courtship was a whirlwind of museum dates, exploring abandoned subway stations, late-night conversations about everything and nothing, and the slow, wonderful, terrifying realization that I had found my person. After a year of dating, he proposed on a trip to Boston. He didn't choose a fancy restaurant or a scenic overlook. He took me to the quiet, dusty aisles of the Boston Athenaeum, one of the oldest libraries in America. Surrounded by the comforting scent of old paper and leather, he knelt down and held out a ring with a beautiful, vintage-style setting from the 1920s. He said he'd spent months searching for it because he knew I'd love its history as much as its beauty. I cried, not just from sheer happiness, but from the overwhelming, unfamiliar feeling of being seen and loved for exactly who I was. I couldn't wait to tell my family. I was naive. I thought that this, finally, would be an achievement they couldn't diminish or ignore. Bringing home a man as successful, respectable, and genuinely good as Ethan had to count for something, right? I called them that night, my voice trembling with excitement. "We have some amazing news! Ethan and I are engaged!" The reaction was immediate and ecstatic, alarmingly so. "An architect! Oh, Cora, how absolutely wonderful!" My mother gushed, her voice an octave higher than usual. "Marcus, did you hear? Ethan, the architect. His firm just landed that massive downtown redevelopment project. It was in the Business Journal." My father's voice boomed over the speakerphone, filled with a triumphant energy that had nothing to do with my happiness. "Excellent. Julian has been trying to get a meeting with their lead developer for weeks. This is perfect timing. Absolutely perfect." My stomach plummeted. In a matter of seconds, my deeply personal, romantic engagement had been stripped down and reassembled into a strategic business opportunity for my brother. It wasn't about me finding a life partner. It was about the family acquiring a valuable asset with a corner office. The following Sunday, we went to their house for what was supposed to be a celebratory dinner. The air was different. For the first time in recent memory, my parents were focused on me, or rather, on the man standing next to me, whose arm I was holding. They fawned over Ethan, hanging on his every word as if he were a visiting dignitary. My mother brought out the good china and the Waterford crystal, which were usually reserved for Christmas or when my father's boss came over. My father, Marcus, poured Ethan a generous glass of his best 5-year-old single malt scotch, a bottle he treated like a holy relic. They peppered him with questions about his portfolio, his family's background, his hobbies. They were charming, attentive, and utterly painfully transparent. Julian arrived late, as was his custom, and gave Ethan a thorough once-over, a flicker of professional assessment in his eyes before he broke into his trademark charming grin. "So you're the guy who finally managed to lock down my quiet little sister," he said, clapping Ethan heartily on the shoulder. "Good on you. Dad says you're doing some incredible work downtown. We should definitely talk business soon." Throughout the entire 2-hour dinner, not a single person asked me about the proposal itself, about my antique ring, about how I felt. They talked around me and through me, using my engagement as a bridge to Ethan's world. I was the conduit, the price of admission to his network. At one point, my mother even had the audacity to say with a tinkling laugh, "We're just so thrilled." We were beginning to worry dear Cora would end up a spinster with all her dusty old books and records. She said it as if it were a charming little joke, but the barb was sharp, deliberate, and meant to remind me of my place. Ethan, to his eternal credit, noticed everything. On the drive home, his hand found mine in the dark. "Your family is intense," he said carefully. "They seem very, very excited for us." I gave a weak, watery smile. "They're excited about your connections for Julian." The truth felt bitter and acidic on my tongue. Ethan squeezed my hand. "Hey, I'm marrying you, not them. Your passion for what you do, for history, is one of the very first things I fell in love with. Don't ever let them make you feel small for it." His words were a balm on a raw wound, but they couldn't erase the familiar ache in my chest. This engagement, the happiest moment of my life, had become the ultimate catalyst. It had put my perceived worth and my family's deep-seated dysfunction on a brightly lit stage. The more they celebrated Ethan, the more glaringly invisible I became. The storm was gathering, and their initial transactional excitement was just the eerie, unsettling calm before the downpour. I tried to believe it would get better, that once the novelty wore off, they would eventually see me in this picture. I couldn't have been more tragically wrong. In the weeks that followed our engagement announcement, my family's behavior spiraled from subtly dismissive to overtly transactional. The thin veneer of parental affection, already worn down by years of neglect, began to disintegrate completely, revealing the cold, calculating machinery that had been operating beneath the surface all along. My engagement wasn't a celebration of my love and happiness. It was a project to be managed, a merger to be executed, and I was merely a peripheral figure in its orchestration. The first major incident occurred when my mother, Eleanor, insisted on hosting an intimate dinner party to formally introduce Ethan to their most influential friends. "It's imperative that people see who is joining our family," she'd said, her voice dripping with a sense of social significance that made my skin crawl. The night of the party, their house was buzzing with a level of energy I hadn't seen since Julian's college graduation party. My mother floated through the room in a new, ridiculously expensive silk dress, introducing Ethan not as Cora's fiancé, but as Ethan Hayes, of the renowned Hayes architectural firm. She would then add, as a barely audible afterthought, "He's engaged to our daughter, Cora." I felt like an accessory he had brought with him. I spent the entire evening trailing in their wake, offering plates of hors d'oeuvres and trying to inject myself into conversations that would immediately pivot back to Ethan's career, his family's summer home on the Cape, or Julian's bright prospects. At one point, I was standing with a group of my father's business associates when Marcus proudly announced, "With Ethan's expertise in urban planning, we're confident Julian will be able to spearhead the financial modeling for the new waterfront development project." A woman in the group, a senior partner at a local law firm, turned to me with a polite, vacant smile that didn't reach her eyes. "And what is it that you do, dear?" Before I could even open my mouth to explain my profession, my mother swooped in, placing a proprietary hand on my arm. "Oh, Cora has the most charming little hobby. She looks up old family trees for people. Digging around in the past? It keeps her busy." She patted my arm condescendingly before steering the conversation back to something more important, like the stock market. I stood there, rooted to the spot, feeling the heat rise in my cheeks, my entire career and passion reduced to a quaint, time-filling pastime. The second incident was even more personal, a violation of something I held dear. I adored my engagement ring. It was a vintage piece from the 1920s, an Art Deco masterpiece with delicate filigree, something Ethan had spent months searching for because he knew I'd love its history and uniqueness. One afternoon, my mother called, her voice syrupy sweet. "Darling, I was just talking to our family jeweler, Mr. Abernathy. He said he'd be happy to give your ring a professional cleaning and check the setting for security. You can never be too careful with an older piece. Just drop it by this afternoon." I hesitated, a strange knot of unease tightening in my stomach, but I complied. It was, on its face, a reasonable and caring request. 2 days later, a notification popped up on my phone. My mother had tagged our jeweler in a new post on her social media. It was a professionally lit, glamorous picture of my ring, not on my hand, but nestled in a plush velvet box, with the caption, "So proud to welcome a Hayes to the family. The future is looking bright and brilliant. Number engaged. Number power couple, number legacy, number family." She hadn't even tagged me in the post about my own engagement ring. She was using this intimate symbol of my love as a prop in her social media campaign, a glittering announcement of the status upgrade my engagement represented. When I confronted her, my voice shaking with a quiet fury, she was genuinely baffled by my anger. "Don't be so terribly sensitive, Cora. I'm just proud. You should be happy that I'm so excited about your future." But the final straw before the breaking point, the act that truly unmasked their intentions, involved Julian. In a grand gesture, my parents announced that they would help Ethan and me with a down payment on a house as a wedding gift. It was an astonishingly generous offer, far beyond anything they had ever done for me, and for a fleeting, foolish moment, I felt a surge of hope. Maybe this was their way of finally showing they loved me, that they saw this as my moment. We spent a weekend looking at properties and found a beautiful, historic townhouse that needed some work but had incredible bones and a story I was eager to uncover. When we presented it to my parents, my father reviewed the listing with a critical, appraising eye. "It's a solid location," he conceded. "Good schools. But the real value here is the strategic proximity to Julian's office. You know, Ethan," he said, turning to my fiancé as if I weren't even in the room, "if you and Cora lived here, it would be a perfect, high-status venue for Julian to host client meetings and networking events. Your home would have a certain architectural prestige that his bachelor pad lacks." Ethan and I exchanged a look of slow dawning horror. He started to speak, but my father cut him off on a roll now. "We'll provide the full down payment, a significant sum, on one condition. You agree in writing to let Julian use the main floor, the living room, dining room, and kitchen for business functions whenever he needs to. Think of it as a family investment. It's a win-win. You get a house, and he gets a professional advantage." I was utterly speechless. They weren't giving us a home. They were attempting to purchase a business annex for my brother, and they expected me to live upstairs like some kind of quiet, on-site manager. It was so brazen, so completely devoid of genuine sentiment, that I could only stare at him, my mouth agape. The silence grew heavy, thick with my unspoken outrage. I looked at my mother, searching for any sign of dissent, but she was nodding in eager agreement, a self-satisfied smile gracing her lips. This was their master plan. My marriage, my home, my future, it was all just collateral to be leveraged for Julian's continued success. That evening, I drove to Ethan's apartment in a complete daze. I relayed the entire conversation, my voice flat and devoid of any emotion. I had moved past anger into a strange, hollow, eerily calm space. When I finished, Ethan was quiet for a long moment. He got up, poured 2 large glasses of wine, and handed one to me. "We are not taking the money," he said simply and firmly. "And we are certainly not living in a house that comes with those strings attached. We will find our own place, on our own terms." Then he looked at me, his expression softening with concern. Cora, I need to tell you something. I had dinner with my mother last night, and I told her about your family, about how they are. She said something that, well, it stuck with me. She said, "It sounds like they don't see her as their daughter. They see her as their son's unpaid assistant." And hearing those words from an outsider, a kind, normal woman who had raised her children with unconditional love and respect, was like a physical blow. It was the ultimate validation for every doubt, every hurt, every feeling of inadequacy I had ever harbored. My entire life, I had been auditioning for a role in a family that had already cast me in a part I never wanted. I was not the other child. I was a supporting character in the blockbuster movie of my brother's life. My parents weren't just neglectful. They were actively, strategically using me. The escalating series of humiliations, from the dinner party to the social media post to the outrageous house proposition, weren't isolated incidents. They were a pattern, a clear and undeniable statement of my perceived worth in their eyes. And their next act, I would soon find out, would be their most public, most calculated, and most devastating performance yet. My parents, completely undeterred by our polite but firm refusal of their generous offer, decided that the perfect way to smooth things over and reassert control was to throw us a lavish engagement party at their exclusive country club. It wasn't presented as a question. It was a decree. "All the arrangements have already been made," my mother announced over the phone, her voice a silken whip, leaving no room for argument. "It's imperative that we make the right impression with Ethan's family and our social circle." It was painfully clear the party wasn't for me or Ethan. It was a carefully staged production for them. It was a grand stage on which they could perform the role of the proud, magnanimous parents of the bride, showcasing their new, high-status connection to the esteemed Hayes family name. Ethan and I, exhausted and worn down, agreed to go. We decided it was better to endure one final public performance than to start a war we weren't yet fully prepared to fight. The night of the party was a surreal, slow-motion nightmare. I wore a simple but elegant navy dress that I loved. A dress that made me feel like myself, only to be greeted at the door by my mother with a pinched, disapproving frown. "Oh, Cora, that's what you chose to wear? I was hoping for something a bit more celebratory. A brighter color, perhaps." She didn't wait for a response, her eyes immediately finding Ethan, who looked impeccable in a tailored charcoal suit. Her face transformed, breaking into a brilliant beam. "Ethan, you look so handsome. Like you were born for this." The room was a sea of unfamiliar faces, my parents' friends, business associates, and distant relatives I hadn't seen in years. Vultures in cashmere and pearls, I thought grimly. Everyone swarmed Ethan, shaking his hand, patting his back, while I was left to make awkward small talk with people who looked at me with a polite confusion, as if wondering how this plain, quiet girl had somehow managed to land such a magnificent prize. Julian was in his element, holding court near the grand piano, a glass of champagne in one hand, laughing loudly and accepting congratulations with the casual grace of a man who believed them to be his due. At one point, I overheard him telling a group of his friends, "Yeah, it's great. Ethan's a solid guy. It's going to open a lot of doors for us in the development world." Us? The word hung in the air, a testament to his deeply ingrained belief that my life, my happiness, my marriage was an extension of his own ambitions. I felt a growing, chilling sense of detachment, as if I were watching a movie about someone else's life. I floated through the evening on a cloud of quiet resignation, my smile feeling like a mask I had glued to my face, accepting hollow congratulations from people who didn't know me and certainly didn't care about me. The climax of the evening, the moment everything crystallized, came with the toasts. My father, Marcus, glass of champagne held high, tapped a fork against it, the sharp clink silencing the room. He stood in the center of the floor, under the grand chandelier, beaming with a proprietary pride. "Friends, family," he began, his voice resonating with false sentimentality. "We are so utterly thrilled to be here tonight, celebrating the union of these two wonderful young people. When your daughter brings home a man, you hope for the best. You hope he's kind. You hope he's successful. But you never, in your wildest dreams, expect her to bring home someone like Ethan Hayes. He paused dramatically, letting the weight of the name settle over the room like a benediction. He went on to praise Ethan's accomplishments, his firm, his family's impeccable lineage, for a solid 5 minutes. I wasn't mentioned once. Finally, with a theatrical sigh, he turned his attention to me. A wave of nervous, foolish anticipation washed over me. This was it. This was his chance to say something kind, something fatherly, something real. "And Cora?" he said, a strange, boozy, self-satisfied smirk playing on his lips. "Well, what can I possibly say about Cora? She's always been our quiet one, the bookworm. Never gave us a moment's trouble." He chuckled, and a few people in the crowd joined in nervously, unsure of the tone. "We always joked," he continued, his voice getting louder, more performative, "that she couldn't possibly be ours. So different from Julian, you know. We told her we must have picked her up from the curb, a little piece of adopted trash somebody left behind." The room went dead silent, the kind of absolute, sucking silence that feels louder than a scream. The nervous laughter died in people's throats. I could feel every single eye in that room on me, 100 points of pity and morbid curiosity. Adopted trash? He had said it. He had taken a cruel, private joke from my childhood, a joke that had always made me feel like an alien in my own skin, a changeling in my own home, and he had broadcast it to a room full of people. He said it at my engagement party. He said it while standing next to the man I loved. It wasn't a slip of the tongue. He had delivered it like a punchline. It was a statement, a public and definitive declaration of how he truly saw me, as lesser, as other, as garbage. My mother, standing beside him, just smiled weakly, a brittle, frozen expression, as if he'd said something charmingly eccentric. Julian looked down at his expensive shoes, a flicker of something shame, embarrassment, crossing his face before he quickly schooled it back into his usual mask of indifference. Ethan, however, went rigid beside me. His hand found mine under the table, his grip like iron, an anchor in my swirling shock. I looked at my father's smiling, oblivious face, and I felt nothing. The hurt, the anger, the lifelong, pathetic yearning for his approval, it all vanished, cauterized in an instant, replaced by a sudden, chilling, absolute calm. The final tether had been severed. He hadn't just insulted me, he had set me free. In that deafening, interminable silence, a new kind of clarity took root. It was cold, it was sharp, and it demanded action. My life as their quiet, accommodating daughter was officially over. My life as a genealogist, a professional seeker of truths, was about to take a very, very personal turn. The drive home from the party was shrouded in a heavy silence. Ethan held my hand, his knuckles white with a rage he was suppressing on my behalf, but he wisely knew I wasn't ready to talk. The silence wasn't empty. It was filled with the echoing shards of my father's words, each one a tiny, sharp piece of glass in my mind. Adopted trash. When we got back to my apartment, I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I walked straight to my desk, my movements deliberate and precise, and powered on my computer. Ethan watched me, his face etched with concern. "What are you doing, Cora?" he asked gently. "I'm working," I replied, my voice unnervingly steady. "My father just gave me a new case to solve. My own." A long-forgotten memory surfaced, a seed of a story I had dismissed years ago as bitter family gossip. It came from my Aunt Genevieve, my mother's estranged, free-spirited younger sister. Aunt Genevieve was the family's official black sheep, an artist, a traveler, and a teller of inconvenient truths, which was why she was rarely invited to family functions. Years ago, during a rare and volatile Thanksgiving visit, she'd had a little too much wine and gotten into a spectacular shouting match with my father. I was a teenager then, hiding in the upstairs hallway, listening with a mix of fear and fascination. "You of all people, Marcus," she had slurred, her voice filled with a strange, potent cocktail of anger and pity, "should know that blood isn't always what it seems in this family. You have no right to be so high and mighty." My father had furiously shut her down, his face purple with rage, and she was asked to leave. We barely saw her after that. At the time, I thought it was just a drunken, meaningless jab. Now it felt like a map. "Ethan," I said, turning away from the glowing screen, "I need to do something. Something my parents will see as the ultimate betrayal. And I need to know, without a single doubt, that you have my back." He came over and knelt in front of me, taking both of my hands in his. His gaze was steady and unwavering. "Cora, after what he said tonight, I will help you burn the whole thing down if that's what you want. Tell me what you need." "I need a DNA test," I said, the words feeling momentous. "Not just one of those simple ancestry kits. I need the most comprehensive genealogical kit on the market, one with health reports and advanced relative matching. And I need samples from my parents and my brother." Ethan's eyebrows shot up. "Okay. How in the world are you going to manage that?" A cold, methodical part of my brain, the part that solves 100-year-old historical puzzles, took over completely. My parents think I'm devastated. They think I'll spend the next week crying in my room. They'll be expecting me to come crawling back to them, begging for an apology and forgiveness. Instead, I'm going to play the part of the dutiful, wounded daughter who wants to mend fences. I'll invite them over for a reconciliation dinner. I'll cook their favorite food. And while they're busy congratulating themselves on their magnanimity, I'll get what I need. The plan felt audacious, almost reckless, but it was fueled by a lifetime of suppressed anger that had finally found its purpose. The next day, I called my mother, carefully pitching my voice to sound fragile and tearful. I told her I was heartbroken, but that I wanted to understand, to talk things through as a family. As I predicted, she was relieved and condescending. "Oh, darling, I knew you'd see sense. Your father didn't mean it, of course. He was just being silly. We'll be there." We set a date for dinner at my apartment. The next piece of the puzzle was Aunt Genevieve. I found her number through a cousin and called her, my heart pounding in my chest. When she answered, her voice was wary. Surprised to hear from me. "Cora? Is that you?" I told her everything what had happened at the party, the exact words my father had used. There was a long, heavy silence on the other end of the line. Then she let out a low whistle. "That arrogant fool," she muttered. "He finally did it." "Aunt Genevieve?" I said, my voice barely a whisper. "What did you mean, all those years ago? About blood not being what it seems?" She sighed, a weary, knowing sound. "It's not my story to tell, honey. It's your grandmother's. But I will say this. Your grandfather, the man whose name your father worships, he and your grandmother had a very, very complicated marriage. There were secrets, big ones." Her words were cryptic, but they were enough. She agreed to help. She had boxes of letters and journals from my grandmother that she had saved after her death, things my mother, in her haste to erase any unpleasantness, had wanted to throw away. And, most importantly, she agreed to take a DNA test herself. The night of the dinner was a masterclass in deception. I cooked my father's favorite meal, a standing rib roast, and listened with feigned patience as he gave a blustering, self-serving non-apology about how it was a poorly landed joke, and that I was being far too sensitive. My mother chimed in, saying the party was a resounding success otherwise. While they were distracted, pontificating and congratulating themselves on their forgiveness, I executed my plan with the precision of a surgeon. A used wine glass from my father, a water bottle from my mother, a fork from Julian. It felt clinical, detached, almost out of body. I sealed the items in labeled evidence bags I'd bought online, my hands perfectly steady. After they left, feeling smug and victorious in their restored parental authority, I prepared the DNA swabs from the items and registered the kits online under anonymous codes. I sent my own kit, Aunt Genevieve's, and the 3 surreptitious samples off to the lab the next morning. The next 6 weeks were the longest, most agonizing of my life. On the surface, I continued as normal. Ethan and I started seriously looking at apartments together, making tangible plans for a future that felt more real and more separate from my family than ever. But beneath the surface, I was a coiled spring of nervous anticipation. I spent my nights digging, using the full force of my professional skills to build a shadow family tree, one based on hypotheses and Aunt Genevieve's cryptic clues. I researched my grandmother's history, her social circles, the timeline of her marriage, the whispers of old scandals. I was no longer just a genealogist. I was an archaeologist, digging into the very foundations of my own identity. I didn't know what I would find, but I knew, with an absolute, chilling certainty, that the truth was buried there. And when those results came in, I would have my weapon. The quiet, bookish girl was gone. In her place was a historian on the verge of rewriting history itself. The email notification arrived on a Tuesday morning, its subject line deceptively simple: "Your DNA results are ready." My heart hammered against my ribs with such force I felt it in my throat. I clicked the link, my hands trembling so much that I had to steady my right hand with my left just to control the mouse. I logged in, bypassing the brightly colored ethnicity estimates, and went straight to the section that mattered: DNA matches. This was the raw data, the part of the results that would connect me to biological relatives, the part that couldn't be misinterpreted. My eyes scanned the page, and then I saw it. The first result was a parent divided by child match, the highest possible connection: Eleanor, my mother. A wave of complicated, bitter relief washed over me. So, she was my mother. The adopted trash comment was, as I had always suspected, just pure, unadulterated cruelty, not a slip of some hidden truth. But that wasn't the discovery that made the air leave my lungs. I scrolled down. The system had correctly identified Julian as a full sibling. It had identified Aunt Genevieve as my maternal aunt, but then I looked at the paternal side. The system had flagged my father, Marcus, with a jarring, impossible label: a half-brother. Not my father, my half-brother. I stared at the screen, my mind refusing to process the words. It had to be a mistake, a glitch in the algorithm. I ran the data again, frantically cross-referencing the centimorgans, the shared DNA segments. There was no mistake. The science was cold, hard, and irrefutable. Marcus and I shared one parent, our mother, Eleanor, but not the other. Which meant my grandfather, the man Marcus had built his entire identity around emulating, was not his biological father. But if Marcus wasn't my father, who was? My brain, trained to solve these exact puzzles, kicked into high gear. I clicked on my top paternal match, a name I didn't recognize, a predicted first cousin. I quickly built out his family tree, my fingers flying across the keyboard with a speed born of desperation. And then I saw the name of his grandfather, a name I knew intimately from my deep dive research into my grandmother's past. A prominent, wealthy doctor she had worked with before she was married. A man who was most definitely not my grandfather. The pieces clicked into place with the sickening finality of a lock. My father, Marcus, was the product of a secret affair. He wasn't the biological son of the patriarch whose name he carried, the name he was so fiercely, arrogantly proud of. But the final, most devastating piece of the puzzle fell into place when I analyzed my own paternal DNA again. It didn't match the doctor. It matched my grandfather, the man Marcus thought was his father. My DNA showed a direct parent divided by child link, a perfect match, to the paternal line I had sourced from distant cousins related to my grandfather. It was scientifically impossible. He had passed away before I was born, but Aunt Genevieve's letters, the ones my mother had tried to discard, explained the impossible. My grandmother, heartbroken and humiliated after discovering her husband was raising a child from his wife's affair, my father, had, years later, found solace with a kind, younger man. But before she could leave her husband, she discovered she was pregnant with my mother, Eleanor. That wasn't the full story. The final, explosive truth was in a sealed letter I had overlooked, marked, "For Genevieve's eyes only." My grandmother, in a moment of despair and loneliness, had a final, secret encounter with her husband, my grandfather, years after they had separated emotionally. This resulted in a hidden pregnancy. To shield the child from the family's toxicity and scandal, she gave the baby girl up for a closed adoption. That baby was me. My biological parents were my legal grandparents. My mother, Eleanor, was my half-sister. My father, Marcus, was my half-brother, and Julian was my nephew. The entire family tree, the entire legacy, was a catastrophic lie. And I, the adopted trash, was the only one with a direct, biological link to the family patriarch. I was the true heir to the very legacy they prized so highly. The weight of the revelation was crushing, but it was immediately followed by a surge of pure, cold, incandescent power. I finally had the truth. Not just a weapon, but a nuclear bomb. I spent the next 48 hours preparing for war. I printed the DNA results, the match comparisons, the damning new family tree illustrated with clear, color-coded lines. I highlighted the most revealing passages from my grandmother's letters. Ethan helped me, his quiet, steady presence a rock in my sea of emotional chaos. He helped me set up a large monitor in the living room of our new apartment, the one we'd rented without a dime of my parents' money. This confrontation would happen on my territory, in my space. I called my parents and Julian. "I have some fascinating family history research to share with you," I said, my voice eerily calm and level. "It's important. Please come to my new apartment on Saturday at noon." The curiosity in their voices was palpable. They agreed immediately, likely assuming it was my final, groveling attempt at reconciliation. When they arrived, the atmosphere in my apartment was charged with tension. I had arranged 4 chairs in the living room, facing the large, blank television screen like a tribunal. "Thank you for coming," I began, my voice betraying no emotion as I stood before them. For my entire life, I have felt like an outsider in this family. At my engagement party, Marcus, you made it clear why. You called me adopted trash. My father immediately started to bluster. "Now, Cora, we've been over this. It was a joke. I'm not finished," I said, my voice as sharp as glass, cutting him off mid-sentence. He recoiled, his mouth hanging open, genuinely shocked. I had never spoken to him like that before. "Your joke prompted me to do what I do best." I started digging. I decided to build our family tree using the most accurate tool available to a modern historian, DNA. I clicked the remote, and the first slide appeared on the screen. It was my mother's DNA profile, showing her as my biological mother. "Congratulations, Eleanor. You are in fact my mother. So at least half of my life wasn't a complete lie." She looked visibly relieved. Julian smirked. "See? I told you she was being overly dramatic." I ignored him and clicked to the next slide. It showed my father's profile next to mine. "Here's where the story gets interesting," I said, my eyes locked on him. "According to the data, you and I share a mother, but we do not share a father. You are not my father, Marcus. You are my half-brother." The color drained from my father's face as if a plug had been pulled. My mother gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. That's ridiculous," she stammered, her eyes wide with panic. "It's a mistake. Those online tests are never accurate." "Science doesn't make mistakes like this, Eleanor," I said flatly. I then presented the cold, hard evidence the centimorgan counts, his lack of connection to our grandfather's paternal line, and his clear connection to the doctor. I watched my father's carefully constructed world of patriarchal pride crumble in real time. He looked at my mother, a desperate, silent question in his eyes, and her inability to meet his gaze was all the confirmation he needed. "But that's not the whole story," I continued, my voice dropping to a near whisper. "Because if you're not my father, who is?" I clicked to the final, devastating slide. It was my DNA profile, showing a direct, undeniable parent-child match with my grandfather's line, the man he had spent his life worshipping and trying to emulate. "It turns out, Marcus, that you were right all along. I'm not your daughter, but I'm not adopted trash either. I am your father's daughter. I am his biological child, born in secret and given away, which makes me your half-sister." I let the words hang in the air, each one a hammer blow. Julian stared, his mouth agape, comprehension dawning with sickening slowness. My father looked like he had been physically struck. My mother was openly, hysterically weeping. "The legacy you're so proud of? The family name you carry?" I said, standing to my full height. "It belongs to me by blood more than it ever belonged to you. The person you called trash is the only true air in this room. The silence that followed was absolute, profound, and terrible. It was the sound of lies shattering, of identities collapsing, of a family being irrevocably, completely broken by the truth. In the suffocating, ringing silence that followed my revelation, no one moved. It was as if the world had stopped spinning, the air in my apartment thick and unbreathable. My father, Marcus, a man I had only ever seen as a pillar of bombastic confidence and unshakable authority, looked utterly and completely broken. His face, usually ruddy with self-satisfaction, was a pale, slack mask of disbelief. All the air had gone out of him. He slowly, shakily, turned to my mother, his voice a hoarse, unrecognizable whisper. "Eleanor, is this true? Tell me it's not true." My mother couldn't speak. She just sobbed, her body racked with the kind of deep, gut-wrenching grief that seemed to carry the weight of decades of deceit. Her silence was his answer. Julian, my brother, my nephew, just stared at the screen, then at me, then back at the screen, his handsome face a canvas of confusion. It was as if he believed that if he stared hard enough, he could force the pixels to rearrange themselves back into the simple, comfortable reality he had always known. I felt a strange, hollow victory, a profound anticlimax. I had wanted to hurt them, to make them feel even a fraction of the searing rejection I had felt my entire life. But seeing them so completely dismantled, their identities stripped away in a matter of minutes, brought me no joy. It was just empty, a quiet, echoing void where my anger used to be. "I think you should all go now," I said quietly, the words feeling inadequate for the gravity of the moment. Ethan, who had been standing silently in the kitchen doorway, a sentinel guarding my back, stepped forward. His presence was a quiet but firm statement of support, a boundary they could not cross. No one argued. They rose like automatons, their movements clumsy and uncoordinated, shuffling towards the door in a daze. My father didn't look at me as he left, his eyes fixed on some distant point, as if he were a stranger in his own life. My mother paused, her hand on the doorknob, her face ravaged by tears and shame. "Cora, I'm so sorry," she began, but the words were hollow, meaningless. She just shook her head and walked out into the hallway. Julian was the last to leave. He stopped in the doorway and looked at me, his eyes filled with a raw bewilderment that bordered on fear. The smug smirk was gone, replaced by the terrified look of a child who has just learned the world is not flat. "I don't understand," he whispered, his voice cracking. "You were supposed to be my sister." "I am who I've always been," I replied, my voice softer than I intended. "This doesn't change who I am. It just changes who you all thought I was." The moment the door closed behind them, I let out a breath I didn't realize I had been holding for 28 years. It came out as a ragged, shuddering sigh. I sank onto the couch, the adrenaline that had been coursing through me draining away, leaving me feeling boneless and utterly exhausted. Ethan was beside me in an instant, wrapping his strong arms around me, pulling me into his chest. I didn't cry. I just felt quiet, like the calm after a Category 5 hurricane has passed, leaving a landscape of unrecognizable rubble. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice a low murmur against my hair. "I think so," I said, my voice muffled by his shirt. "I feel like I just finished a book I've been forced to read my entire life. And now I finally get to choose a new one." That night, I blocked their numbers from my phone. It wasn't an act of spite or anger, but one of deep, instinctual self-preservation. I needed space. I needed silence. I needed to exist, for the very first time, without the crushing, suffocating weight of their expectations and their meticulously crafted narrative. The days that followed were peaceful in a way I had never experienced. The constant, low-level hum of anxiety that had been the background music to my entire life was gone. I woke up in the mornings feeling lighter, as if a physical weight had been lifted from my shoulders. Ethan and I focused on us. We finalized the lease on our new apartment, a bright, airy space with large windows that felt like a sanctuary. We spent a long weekend painting the walls a warm, welcoming shade of sage green. We went to flea markets and antique shops, picking out furniture that we both loved, pieces that had their own history but were now part of our new story. We were building a home, not just a house, and we were doing it on our own terms, with our own hands. Aunt Genevieve called a few days after the confrontation. Her voice was dry, without a hint of surprise. "Your mother called me," she said. "It was quite the performance. Screaming, then crying, then begging for answers she's had for 30 years. I told her the answers were in the journal she tried to throw in a bonfire after your grandmother died." "How are they?" I asked, a flicker of morbid curiosity I couldn't suppress. "A complete and utter mess," she said bluntly. "Marcus has apparently locked himself in his study and is refusing to speak to anyone. Julian is adrift. It turns out, when your entire sense of self is based on a lie, the truth leaves you with nothing to hold on to." I didn't feel guilty. I felt a grim sense of karmic justice. They had built their grand family house on a foundation of secrets and lies, and I had simply held up a mirror to the cracks. The collapse was entirely their own doing. 2 weeks later, Ethan and I sent out new wedding invitations. We canceled the extravagant, soulless country club affair my parents had planned. Instead, we decided on a small, intimate ceremony at the city's historical library, the place where he had proposed, followed by a heartfelt reception at our favorite little Italian restaurant. The guest list was small, comprised only of people who genuinely loved and supported us. Ethan's wonderful, normal family, my fierce Aunt Genevieve, and a handful of our closest friends. It was a declaration of intent. We were starting our new life surrounded by our chosen family, not the one dictated by biology and bitter obligation. For the first time, I felt an exhilarating, terrifying sense of freedom. I was no longer Cora, the lesser daughter, the family footnote. I was just Cora, and that, I was beginning to realize, was more than enough. My past had been a prison of secrets, but the truth, as painful and destructive as it was, had finally, irrevocably set me free. 1 year can change everything. A year after the day my old life was shattered into a million pieces, I stood on the small, wrought-iron balcony of the home Ethan and I had bought, a cup of hot tea warming my hands against the crisp autumn air. It was a charming little row house in a historic district, with a small garden out back that I had filled with lavender and roses, a house we had found and financed entirely on our own. Inside, the walls were lined with bookshelves, and on the large oak desk in my new, sun-drenched home office sat the framed business license for root and branch genealogy, my own successful and highly sought-after consulting firm. The irony of my life's path was not lost on me. The skills I had honed to survive, a family that made me feel invisible, the quiet observation, the meticulous research, the ability to piece together a narrative from fragmented clues were now the foundation of a thriving career, helping others find the sense of belonging I had never known. My life was unrecognizable from the quiet, anxious, small existence I had led before. The silence in my home was no longer the oppressive quiet of being ignored, but the peaceful, comforting quiet of contentment. My marriage to Ethan was a true partnership, built on a foundation of unwavering respect, deep belly laughs, and the shared, simple joy of building a life together. His family had embraced me not as an in-law, but as their own. His mother, a warm, funny, retired teacher, had become the maternal figure I had always craved, supportive, genuinely interested in my life, and fiercely proud of my accomplishments for their own sake. Aunt Genevieve had become a fixture in our lives, a whirlwind of artistic energy, brutal honesty, and unconditional love. She and I, over many late-night phone calls and shared bottles of wine, had pieced together our grandmother's full, tragic story. She was a woman trapped by the unforgiving circumstances of her time. In understanding her life, I had finally come to understand the fractured origins of my own. The justice for my former family was not legal or retributive. It was the quiet, inevitable, organic consequence of their own actions. The truth had acted like a powerful solvent, dissolving the toxic bonds of their dysfunctional dynamic. My father, Marcus, had suffered the biggest, most precipitous fall. His entire identity, so carefully constructed on the prestige of a name that wasn't his by blood and a sense of superiority that was entirely unearned, had been a house of cards. He had, as Aunt Genevieve reported, suffered a complete breakdown after the revelation and spent several months in an intensive therapy program. He resigned from his firm, unable to face the social and business circles where he had once reigned as a minor king. The last I heard, he and my mother had sold their large house and he was living a quiet, reclusive life, a ghost of the bombastic, arrogant man he once was. His punishment wasn't one I had inflicted. It was the devastating, internal loss of a self he had never truly earned the right to be. My mother, Eleanor, had fared differently, though no less tragically. After a period of deep, dramatic depression, she chose a path that was, in its own way, even sadder: complete and utter denial. In her mind, the scandal was a temporary storm, a bit of unpleasantness to be weathered until she could reconstruct a new social reality that suited her. She attempted to re-establish contact with me a few months after the confrontation, sending a lavish Christmas card addressed to Mr. and Mrs. Ethan Hayes, as if nothing had ever happened. I sent it back, unopened, with a simple note: return to sender, address unknown. I learned through the family grapevine that she and my father were still legally married, but their relationship was a hollow shell, held together by decades of shared history and the terror of social appearances. She had what she had always valued most: her status, however tarnished, but she had lost the very family she claimed to be upholding all those years. Julian's fate was perhaps the most telling. Cut off from the unearned influence of the family name and my father's powerful network, he was forced to rely on his own merits for the very first time in his pampered life. He struggled immensely. He lost his cushy, high-paying job during a round of layoffs and was now working at a smaller, less prestigious firm, his once golden career trajectory permanently altered. He had tried to contact me once, a long, rambling email that was a pathetic mix of half-hearted apology and bitter accusation, blaming me for ruining everything. I deleted it without replying. He had spent his entire life as the sun, and he simply couldn't comprehend a universe that didn't revolve around him. Without my parents' constant, blinding adoration to fuel him, his light had dimmed to a faint, sputtering glow. I did not seek this outcome. I did not wish them ill, but I did not mourn their self-inflicted exile either. My boundary, established in the quiet of my own heart, was clear and absolute. A relationship with me, however tenuous, required a full-throated acknowledgement of the truth and a genuine taking of responsibility. Since none of them were capable of that, there was simply no relationship to be had. My family was now Ethan, his wonderful parents, my fierce Aunt Genevieve, and the close-knit circle of friends who had celebrated our union in that beautiful, quiet library. It was a family built not on a tangled, poisonous web of secrets and lies, but on the solid, fertile ground of mutual respect, unconditional love, and joyful acceptance. One afternoon, while sorting through some of my grandmother's old belongings that Aunt Genevieve had given me, I found a small, faded photograph tucked into the back of a book. It was of a young woman with my eyes, holding a baby swaddled in a white blanket. On the back, in faint, looping pencil, it read, "My little Cora, may you find the life of truth I couldn't." It was my grandmother, holding me. In that moment, it felt like a message sent across time, a blessing from a woman I never knew but whose blood ran in my veins. The life she had wished for me, a life of freedom, truth, and authentic love, was the life I was finally, proudly living. The generational curse of secrets and lies had ended with me. Looking back on the wreckage of my old life, it's easy to see the journey as one defined by pain and betrayal, and it was. The insidious, daily cruelty I endured, culminating in that spectacularly humiliating night, left scars on my soul that will likely never fully fade. But that isn't the whole story. It's not even the most important part. The greatest lesson I've learned is that sometimes your identity isn't defined by where you come from, but by what you have the courage to leave behind. For 28 years, I tried to earn a place at a table where I was never truly welcome. I made myself smaller, quieter, and less demanding, operating under the flawed childhood belief that if I asked for nothing, I wouldn't be a burden. I thought that was a strategy for earning love. I thought that was what it meant to be family. I was profoundly wrong. The truth, when it finally came, was a brutal, cleansing fire. It ripped apart everything I thought I knew about myself and the people who were supposed to love me most. But in the ashes of that old life, I found something invaluable, something that had been buried under the rubble of their expectations, my true self. The DNA test didn't give me a new identity. It simply confirmed what I had always felt in my bones, that I was different, that I didn't quite fit. And it taught me that being different wasn't a flaw to be hidden. It was a fact to be understood. The real liberation wasn't in discovering my true bloodline or my biological claim to a family legacy I never wanted. The liberation was in the act of seeking the truth for myself, of taking control of my own narrative after a lifetime of having it dictated to me. My father's insult was meant to be a cage, a final, public confirmation of my worthlessness. Instead, it became the key that unlocked the door. He called me trash, and in doing so, he inadvertently gave me permission to finally throw out the toxic, soul-crushing relationship that had been holding me back my entire life. Family, I've learned with a certainty that settles deep in my bones, is not about shared DNA. It's not about obligation or the accident of birth. Real family are the people who see you, who celebrate you, who make you feel like you belong exactly as you are, without caveat or condition. It's the person who holds your hand in a silent car after a devastating public humiliation and doesn't ask you to explain your pain. It's the estranged aunt who kept your grandmother's secrets safe for you, a silent guardian across the years. It's the new mother-in-law who welcomes you with open arms and tells you she's proud of you just for being you. Family is a choice. It's the home you build with intention, not the one you were born into by chance. My life now is rich in ways I never knew how to imagine before. My work gives me a profound sense of purpose. My husband gives me a love that is a safe harbor. And my chosen family gives me a sense of belonging that is real, unconditional, and unwavering. I no longer feel like a footnote in someone else's story. I am the author, the editor, and the main character of my own. So I want to ask all of you, have you ever had a moment, big or small, that forced you to redefine what family means to you? What did you discover about your own strength in the process? Please share your stories in the comments below. I read every single one of them, and I know that your experiences can be a light for others who might be feeling lost in the dark. If this story resonated with you, please give this video a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel for more stories of resilience, and share it with someone who might need a reminder that their worth is not determined by the family they were given, but by the beautiful, authentic life they have the courage to create for themselves. Thank you for listening. And remember, sometimes you have to burn down the old, rotten family tree to let the new, healthy one grow.